Keeping your tires properly inflated protects the environment, gives you peace of mind, and saves you money for more important things. So just check it once a month. A message from Cal Recycle.
All right, having a quorum, I would like to open the December 2nd meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Planning Commission. Ms. Rodriguez, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Larson.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs.
Here.
Vice Chair Jostes.
Here.
Chair Bartlett.
Here. Under preliminary matters, our first action will be to review the minutes and resolutions. First of all, we have the draft minutes of November 18th, and then resolutions 01610 and 01710. So are there any comments to the draft minutes of November 18th? Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only mistake I saw was that we have Commissioner Justice here and away in the roll call at the top of the page. So if we could just get him out of the roll call. I think he's really absent.
Okay. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question perhaps is for Mr. Cotto. The names identified under staff present, I'm not recalling that all of those individuals were present here. Did they come in and out at some point? I don't remember seeing Mr. Dayton, for example, but perhaps I was preoccupied with our items and didn't notice him in the room.
I didn't notice him either. We'll double check. We'll
Okay.
double check and delete whoever wasn't really here.
Okay, thank you. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Great. Okay, no further comments. Then let's go on to resolution.
Oh, Mr. Chair, I need to abstain from the Cottage Hospital item.
Right, as do I.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, resolution 01610 for 2102 Edgewater Way. Okay, I don't see any lights. Let's move on to resolution 01710 for 163 La Jolla Drive. Okay, I have one comment. It's on page 9, the last page, and the last word is just to correct the spelling of Commissioner Justice. Okay, seeing no other comments, do I have a motion for approval of the minutes and resolutions as amended?
So moved.
Second? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Cotto, are there any requests for continuances, withdrawals, or postponements of ex-agenda items?
No, there are not.
How about announcements and appeals?
Nope.
No. Okay, with that, I will open public comment, and I see we do have one speaker slip, so Jeffrey, is it Bard?
Yes, sir. Barb,
Yes,
Mr. D.
please, come on up.
Hi, I myself am a native son of California, and I tried to assemble some remarks pertaining to the last meeting, and I did some research on the internet and some of the things that are on the public record that were said. And it'd be very difficult for me to frame any statement that would be in keeping with the holiday spirit. So I'd like to quote John Steinbeck. The point being that the problem is much bigger than Santa Barbara. I have never resisted change, even when it has been called progress. And yet I felt resentment towards strangers swamping what I thought of as my country with noise and clutter. I don't have a working timer here.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me...
So, can I take that for time, roughly?
There you go.
Want to reset it back?
Okay.
Okay. This is from Travels with Charlie, 1962. I've never resisted change, even when it has been called progress, and yet I felt resentment toward the strangers swamping what I thought of as my country with noise and clutter. And of course, these new people will resent the newer people. I remember when I was a child, we responded to the natural dislike of strangers. We who were born here, like myself, felt a strange superiority over newcomers, barbarians, forestieri, which would be homeless. And they, the foreigners, resented us and even made a rude poem about us. Well, since this is going to be televised, you'll have to look up the rude poem yourselves. We were an outrage to the Spanish Mexicans, and they, in their turn, on the Indians. Could that be why the sequoias make folks nervous? Those natives were grown trees when a political execution took place on Golgotha. They were well toward middle age when Caesar destroyed the Roman Republic in the process of saving the Roman Republic. To the Sequoias, everyone is a stranger, a barbarian. And I might add, to the Sequoias, we're all homeless immigrants. Skipping forward, I'll conclude with the remark, and no solution has been found. You can't forbid people from being born. John Steinbeck.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much. With that, I will close public comment, and we will go on to our first item, which is a discussion item. And this is the Planning Commission's review of the standard conditions of approval. And I believe Allison DeBusk will be giving us the staff presentation.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, Chair Bartlett and Commissioners. This is the annual review of our conditions of approval menus. I want to start out just by explaining what our goals were with this recent update. We wanted to make the conditions of approval more efficient and concise, and also more accurate and enforceable. Towards the first goals, in order to achieve that, we combined some duplicate conditions. We also eliminated conditions that were actually mitigation measures. And we eliminated conditions that were simply restatements of state and federal or local laws. In order to make the conditions more accurate and enforceable, we identified the staff that was responsible for ensuring that the condition was implemented. And also, we identified when that condition was required. And this involved reorganization of some of the conditions, and then also something that's new with the conditions, which is some hidden text that will allow staff to understand when that particular condition might be most appropriate. So our conditions of approval were previously separated into 3 different templates or menus, and one template was for subdivisions, one template was for condominium conversions, and one template was for all other projects that didn't have subdivision maps. What we noticed is that recently we'd had some projects that the public improvements or even some private improvements needed to be installed prior to recordation of the map. And the way that our conditions were worded, it made that very difficult and confusing for both the applicant and staff. And so we created a new track, which we call the A track, and that is for maps where the public improvements are done first and then the map records, as opposed to our more common subdivision project where the map records first and then the improvements are completed along with the construction of the development. Rounding this out, the C track is what we refer to the condominium conversions as, and the D track is projects without subdivision maps. I haven't created slides to go over each individual condition, but I do have the conditions available, and so we can discuss anything that the Commission may be interested in knowing more about or any questions that you may have. Thank you. Also, Susie Reardon is here, and this update actually did start as a way to ensure that the staff hearing officer conditions were consistent with the Planning Commission conditions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, is there any public comment relative to this item before I bring it back to the Commission? Seeing none, are there any questions from the Commission, and then we can roll into comments? Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. My question is, on page 2 of the staff report, you say that conditions that are difficult to enforce have been eliminated or revised to make them more enforceable. Can you give some examples of that? Because just because something is a little difficult to enforce, it may still have been a good condition. It doesn't seem that getting rid of it is necessarily the best way to proceed. So an example might be helpful.
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Jacobs, off the top of my head, I can't think of one, but I will go through them and see what comes to mind. I think what we did most often with those is we added a staff contact. whether it be the planning division or transportation division, we put somebody in charge of making sure that it happened. But I will look to see for any that were eliminated because of that, and I'll get back to you.
And I have, when do we get to comments?
Okay. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have the same question that Commissioner Jacobs just raised for the same reasons. On page 3, sort of a general question. I assume the order is based on what just sort of physically needs to be done, that in terms of a project moving forward, like, you don't put in the utilities before you do the grading kind of thing. Is that the basis for making the list?
Commissioner Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, there are actually several things that play into that, and that's one of the reasons why we added that new condition that lays out the order of development. The way that our conditions were ordered before didn't necessarily reflect the order in which they were supposed to take place. And so that's what the order of development is intended to do most obviously. For example, previously we would have conditions that needed to be shown on the building permit, like you need to provide a trash enclosure or a project directory, things like that. And they were listed under the building permit, when in reality those needed to be approved as part of the design review. And so that's what some of the ordering resulted in. We moved it up so that it got caught at the appropriate time rather than at building plan check, having the applicant go back and say, oh no, now I need to get design review of this aspect because I didn't previously.
Okay, thank you. And then the example you gave before with the filing of the map becoming before or after what seemed as if I couldn't I guess I'm kind of surprised to see that you have the developer has the option of doing one or the other, and it would seem as if you would need to have the map first to know what should happen next.
Commissioner Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, there are times when it's desirable to have access to the lots before they're actually split. And so that would be an instance where the developer would install the public road first and then subdivide the property. There are also times when the only access would be a private road. And so by having the construction of those private improvements done first, we can ensure that when it's subdivided, there's appropriate access and that an individual homeowner isn't caught having to put in everyone's driveway.
Okay, thank you. And then I was puzzled by page 3D3, conditions that are actually mitigation measures only required where there is a significant environmental impact have been removed and will be contained in an initial study template. I'm wondering how it can be in a template if it's something you don't know about ahead of time.
Commissioner Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, there are certain mitigation measures that we apply to projects often, and so we do have standard language. For example, if a project had a solid waste impact, there are certain standard mitigations that we would apply, but we wouldn't apply them to every project. It's only if there's a demonstrated environmental impact. So we've just taken that language and moved it into our template for initial studies as an option for a possible mitigation measure. So that's not something that the Planning Commission may normally have seen in our templates. It was just something that when staff goes through the conditions of approval, it's a condition that we almost always have to delete. So it's just a time saving for staff in the future.
Okay, and I think I have a couple more questions here. Oh dear. Page 29 of 44, that's the staff conditions of approval, the B track. The top line says an exploratory demolition permit would be issued. to allow the preparation of the report as to whether or not a building was salvageable. And that sounds a little bit, well, you're going to go in there and demolish part of it, or is it just enough to see whether or not the building is salvageable? Is that the...
Commissioner Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, yes, it's enough to see if the building is salvageable.
Chair Bartlett, Commissioner Lodge, just to go a little bit into detail on that one, because that's new, sort of. We've applied it in a couple of cases, but especially for modifications, a lot of times applicants will come to us and say, look, we want this modification because we're keeping the building and it's green, and so please let us have this modification. We're changing a use in a building that encroaches into a setback or whatever. And then we say, yeah, okay, grant the mod because it all seems reasonable. And then when time for construction comes, they say, oh, well, we opened it up and it's all termite ridden, so we demoed the whole thing, so we want to be able to build it back, so we should be able to build it back. And we don't want to be in playing that game, So the purpose of the condition is to say, yeah, okay, the modification is we're granting it based on you're keeping the building. So if you can't keep the building, you'll have to come back to us. And this allows a process whereby they can go and actually do an exploratory demo and make sure that it's all good before they actually demo the building and come back and say, oh, it's already done.
And I assume this is a process whereby a building inspector goes out and looks at it, and they're not just taking the person's word for it. Okay, thank you. On page 2 of, this is just a typo, B-track template, page 2 of 5, items 22 and 23 are the same. They both say recyclable material use and collection. It's on the B-track template, page 2.
Page 11, right? 11 of 44?
No.
Where am I looking?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge,
Okay.
The reason that's listed twice is because there are two conditions for slightly different uses. They were originally one condition and they were split into two to make it easier for staff to apply to the appropriate type of project, whether it's a restaurant or
Hotel.
or a hotel. So
Maybe it should say that, because otherwise it says exactly the same thing.
Commissioner Lodge, if you look at page 11 of 44, you can actually see the language of the condition, and maybe we could add something to the title to make it slightly different, to differentiate them. One could say 4 hotels and one could say 4 restaurants. There is hidden text right there that says
okay.
Use this one for hotels and use this one for restaurants.
Okay, thank you. And then on the next page of the B-track template, page 3 of 5, 2G, it says prepare a structural crack survey and video reconnaissance. I assume this only relates to certain projects where a building is being demolished to see the effect on neighboring structures. Is that what that's about?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, that is correct. And if you look at the full language as part of Exhibit A, it will explain exactly when they would be applied. I'm not sure exactly what page it's on, but it does explain when we'd apply that type of condition.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Great. Are there any other questions? Mr. Jostis, I see your light went out, so. Okay. I had a question. It shows up, I guess it's on the A track, page 13 of 44, and it's more about sort of your hidden text that tells you when to use the conditions. When it's item number 4, when they're talking about the water rights assignment. and it says always include it, and yet there's a lot of areas in Santa Barbara that, for example, out in Goleta that are Goleta Water District, or Coast Village Road that is Montecito Water District. So wouldn't the hidden text say apply only when it's, within certain parameters and not when it's with a different water district?
Chair Bartlett, this is actually this is a restriction on water rights, so people can't dig a well on their property. That's what essentially this does. When the owners of properties assign water rights to the city, that basically means they can't drill a well anymore. And that we always put that on anybody that's in the city because we don't want them drilling their own wells.
Even though it's a different water jurisdiction?
Correct.
Oh, okay. Okay. And then also on page 12 of 44, item B, which is garages available for parking, isn't that almost one of those conditions that's too hard to enforce? I mean, we have it, but we can't.
Chair Bartlett, yeah, that is an example of a condition that can be difficult to enforce, and also that does reiterate what our code says. But one of the reasons that we kept it in is because it's part of the required CCNRs, and so what that does is put the onus on the homeowners association to enforce it.
Okay.
We would have that requirement regardless.
Right. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, if there's no, Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question about tree protection measures. And the city obviously has some considerable experience in mitigation monitoring. And I was curious as to whether taking the results of that kind of look-see after things are done over time, that you're confident that we've got the right numbers in terms of replacement ratios. I know accidents happen, and that's just part of the way things come about. But I was curious. I've always thought that the tree replacement ratios seemed a little bit low, and they're I think they're largely 3 to 1. And so I was wondering if there's any insights you can give us based upon what you've observed through monitoring, whether that's still a legitimate and a cautious ratio to use.
Commissioner Joseph, Chair Bartlett, we don't have anything that we could tell you right now, but that's something we can go back and talk to our environmental analyst and see about that.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Cotto. It would be nice to see the mitigation. I mean, I know what the purpose of this exercise is to get it to work better from the permitting perspective. It would just be nice at some point, whether it's a lunch meeting or another agenda item, to see how all the hard work that's done with mitigation monitoring and the projects, and I know some of the monitoring plans are, many dozens of pages, if not hundreds of pages thick. I'd like to see how that translates, or if that better informs how we construct these conditions, because that's the whole purpose of mitigation monitoring, is to be adaptable and how would you say, accountable for what we think is going to happen and what actually happens. So if there's some way at some point in time we can kind of get the 10,000-foot view of this and connect the dots, I think it would help us to know when to make exceptions and when to just stand by the standard conditions.
Chair Bartlett, Commissioner Joseph, we'll try to do that. The extent of mitigation monitoring that I'm familiar with when these projects is to make sure that, within the time frame that's allotted, usually through construction and maybe a year or two beyond, is that the trees have been planted and they're watered and they seem to be thriving. I know we don't normally go back 5 or 10 years later to see which ones of these trees actually survived. So it might be a little bit tougher to do that, but we'll see what we can do.
Mr. Cotto, I'm not suggesting that any additional field work be done. I'm just thinking that if you've got somebody who's been out in the field with the experience of 4 or 5 years or more doing the same types of things, whether they see trends, that's important for us to think about. I don't want to create more work. I know you have plenty on your plate. So it's just more of a bring the essence of the lessons learned from these two processes together.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Schwartz, I believe you have a question.
Is it time for comments, or have we completed the question portion?
You have a question, Mr. Jordan has a question.
Hold
Okay,
off. I'm
great.
ready for comments whenever it's appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one, just thinking from the other side of the rail, while this is an attempt to make this keep up with regulations and make it more efficient and consistent, certainly the consideration should be that should be an expectation of the customer, too. And I'm wondering what type of process you go through when you make changes like this once a year to gather feedback, or what type of, not asking for more work again, but what type of measurement you gather back from your customers to ensure that what the steps you take are actually benefiting them also.
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Jordan, in terms of developing this, we didn't do any type of public outreach or discussion with applicants or people who use the process often. What I can tell you, though, is some of the things that went into it were based on staff's experience working primarily with an inexperienced developer, someone who might only have one project in the city, and they're trying to read through the language in these conditions, and they don't have any idea how to actually implement it or what comes first, because the language seemed fairly cyclical. You do this first, but first you do that. And so part of the attempt was to really lay that out for them. So we do think that the order of development condition right up front will really help the layperson understand these conditions. And we also took out some redundant language and that sort of thing, so we hope it will be just more readable and understandable for the average person.
Thanks. Just what I would expect, of course. I think maybe in next year, possibly one of the suggestions I would have is that maybe some of those comments that are responding to customer input, you could include just some bullets in the staff report, so that question's answered up front, that here's some things that we're actually doing to respond to deficiencies that our customers see. Thanks.
Okay, seeing no further questions, I'll open it up for comments. Ms. Schwartz, I know you were ready to go a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to thank staff for putting this package together. I'm sure, Ms. DeBusk, thank you so much, because I'm sure it was quite time-consuming, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I would like to underscore what I think is important, and you've mentioned it on page 4, paragraph 6, which is that any new process, and I think this should be a key objective of ours, is to ensure that a more fair and consistent application is made of the conditions. And I think this will help all involved. And we have found on projects where one or more individuals believe that there hasn't been this type of process, that I think improvement and perhaps satisfaction will be had by more. And then I want to go back to page 2. Ms. Jacobs referenced conditions. For me, the sequence is a little off. I would rather identify appropriate enforcement measures. Excuse me. I would rather identify appropriate conditions to be applied on a project and then determine what it will take to enforce that, rather than tailor the conditions to our enforcement resources or process at the time. So for me, if it's a way to frame this, I think this is a little backwards. I think we need to decide what's best for the city in terms of planning and development, and then determine what we need to do within the city to ensure that there's appropriate follow-through by the property owner or the developer. So with that, those are my summary comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. What page were you referring to?
Page 2, I think Ms. Jacobs was
of
referring
the staff
to
report?
Page 2 of the staff
Right,
report.
okay.
Thank you. Yes. Paragraph Roman numeral 4.
Oh, okay.
Ms. Jacobs asked for examples
Yes.
of these conditions, and I was referencing some of that same language.
Great, thank you. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. Just following up on Ms. DeBusk's clarification of who the target audience for this document is. In some ways, it's the beginning developer, someone who may have one project, rather than someone who has done this 25 times and knows the process probably better than most of us who are here for a short time, relatively speaking. But I want to go back to that person who may only be in it for the first time and the educational aspect that this document has. Even though in some ways it seems redundant, it educates the volunteers who are on the review boards, including the design review boards, some of whom are architects, but some of whom are historians or landscape architects. And some of this language, I think, even though it appears redundant, should be kept. And I'll give you some specifics for it. I was warned about planners when I first came onto the Planning Commission. They said they love acronyms and making everything really short and easy to get to. And there's a good reason for that. It's because from inside, because we can say, well, we know what we're talking about. But for someone coming in from the outside, they might not know what that means. And so sometimes a little extra language is a very helpful thing. And in this document, I think there's some places where I would like to see it stay, even though it might make the document longer. And one of those, I'm not necessarily going in order, but one of those is Section G, pages 33 through 37 on Track B, which is the section that talks about construction practices, watering the dirt, where people can park, what the hours of construction are. And that whole section, page after page, is cut out, and in the margin it says refer to some other documents. And if we're just telling people they can refer to the municipal code or some other arcane document, I think we're not really doing our job. And either we can leave it in the conditions of approval for people to be aware of. It's page 33 to 37. Or there could be some separate handout. Maybe it's a brochure or something that takes these 4 pages and puts it into a handout that can be given to people that says, here's the summary of best practices for a construction site. And it could be available to neighbors of a large construction project. It could be available to developers who are new to this process. But I think referring someone to the permit codes and the municipal code is going too far towards simplification on Section G. Shorter but easier, on page 32 and 33, we took out some information about construction signage, and I'd like to see it put back. The construction signs, as it's written in here, would be at staff discretion. The language says that if it's a project that's anticipated to be of neighborhood concern or a big or controversial project, that it should have a construction sign. And I would like to ask that every project have a construction sign. The extent of it would be flexible in that if it's a small construction project, it doesn't need a big construction sign. But the necessity to have a contact number is a real necessity for most of our construction projects. And if there's no construction number to call, there's no contact number for people in the neighborhood, then they're kind of left with no way to register a complaint or to ask for help, or to say, somebody was idling a construction truck at 5 a.m. this morning, what can I do about it? Maybe they don't want to go out and hassle with the truck driver. So having a number that they can call would be useful for almost every project, not just a few. On page, I think it's 19. Can't read my own writing. On page 19 of 44, you took out from design review the commercial and multifamily project dumpster review because it's in the fire code. Not everyone on the HLC is going to know about that, so can we put those 3 sentences back in? Because where the dumpster goes is one of those things you don't want to leave till the last minute. I think we'll be talking about that more today, later on. The dumpster needs to be considered early on. And then I have one more substantive, and this is my last comment. It's on page 11 of 44. Item number 25 in section C, which is the off-site parking agreement. The way it's currently done, if the owner is going to require off-site parking to meet the required parking or generated parking demand as determined by transportation, if they need to ask for off-site parking, currently they have to come back to Planning Commission if they can't meet their requirement. And this condition says that, I guess for expediency, instead they could go to the Community Development Director and the Transportation Manager. And I'm not sure why that change would be made, or if there's any overriding legal concern for it, but personally I think when off-site parking or any kind of parking change is being made, it ought to be a public decision made in a public forum, because it can intensify or result in an intensified development in a neighborhood or in a, well, they're all neighborhoods, and rather than being a Community Development Director decision, I think it should stay at a Planning Commission or show hearing level.
Chair Bartlett, Commissioner Jacobs.
Unless I'm reading that completely wrong.
Well, maybe not completely. First of all, an off-site parking agreement is allowed by right. It doesn't require the Planning Commission or any other discretionary review body to approve it. If it's within the parameters of the parking ordinance, and that's basically within 500 feet. If you're within 500 feet, you can do it without by right. If you're within 1,250 feet, it requires approval by the parking manager. So that's allowed by the ordinance. Second thing, by the time it gets to the Planning Commission, we know that they're going to be asking for it. So this will be, you'll know that it's, you'll know, the Planning Commission will know that an off-site parking agreement is being as part of the project description. And the purpose of this condition is to just ensure that that gets done, that they actually go into that off-site parking agreement. If a project somehow came to the commission with full parking on site and then afterwards it came back and said, well, we don't want to do the parking, we're going to do an off-site parking agreement, we would definitely come back to the Planning Commission for that type of thing, because that's a change of the project description, and that would be we would come back for at least a level 3 substantial conformance, which is a lunch meeting. But I mean, that would be hard to imagine that someone would go through all that trouble and then change it, after the approval. Does that help at all?
I read it differently, but your explanation makes sense. And those are my comments.
Commissioner Jostis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One residual question and one comment. Are these conditions in their kind of template format or something similar to that available to applicants to review, or is it strictly an internal document? I mean, I know this is a tool to save time so that you can put forth conditions so that whoever approves this or whoever moves forward with the permit can use them to be nimble in getting the project done and do what they're supposed to do. But I'm curious as to whether, building on Ms. Jacobs' comment as far as educational issues, is this ever something that would go on the web or anything like that?
Commissioner Bartlett and Commissioner Jostes, although it's not something that we publish, it is, once we have a project that's being reviewed, we'll take these conditions and tailor them to that project, and that will be sent to the applicant as part of the DART process. So they'll have an early chance to see which of these conditions might apply to their project. But the document as a whole, most conditions aren't applicable to most projects, so we really cut it down before we give it to any applicant.
Okay, so this is more applicant and decision maker centric than it is a broadcast of the way the city conditions projects. Is that fair to say? And I'm not leading you in any direction. I'm just trying to get my head around this thing. Because a couple of years ago, and I think even a couple of years before that, I suggested that we might be able to use hypertext in here to get a lot of the details put back layers below this, so that what the applicant gets at the final end of the day is something that they can go into. And it continues to intrigue me that with an intern from Environmental Studies Department of UCSB, you could really go in and highlight some of these terms, so that if an applicant does want to go deeper, they can have an even more succinct set of conditions. And for example, if there's a staff contact, if they could run their mouse over a highlight of who's responsible, they've got the phone number there, and they can call them up and say, if there's a problem, this is how we could fix it. I think there's a way to just take this one more step from a technology standpoint to make it easier to use, less costly to apply, and it might get some of that education piece that Ms. Jacobs is interested in focused in on the real user, because for the most part the real user is the person who's the applicant and constructing the project. Again, just a thought, but that's, other than that, I mean, that's the only comment I've got. So these are, from my standpoint, quite good.
Chair Bartlett?
Yes.
I just wanted to really quickly respond to Commissioner Jacobs' question regarding conditions that were eliminated because they were difficult to enforce. I did find two examples. One of them being the holiday of Cesar Chavez, which is not a widely known holiday, although it is a holiday that the city observes. So we were suggesting removing that because it has become an issue. If people work, they don't realize they're working on a holiday. By the time city staff is back in the office, it's too late. It's already happened. So that was one that we removed for enforceability. Also, construction equipment maintenance and making sure that they're professionally maintained and fitted with standard mufflers. That's not something that our building inspectors are going out and doing. It may be appropriate if there's a project environmental coordinator or someone else monitoring the project, but for a typical permit that doesn't have environmental concerns, we felt that that condition was just not something that was ever being enforced. So,
Thanks for the clarification. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you. I just had one thought as this discussion went on, which is where do an observation from my own time up here at the commission, where do the C of A's go? And actually there's three places that they go that as commissioners we always can be reminding ourselves of. Bill Mahan used to make the reminder, and I'll make it today, that the conditions of approval, they get printed onto the blueprints that go out to the construction site where anyone can look at them. They also go into the street file such that if somebody historically wants to go and find out, well, what was supposed to happen at this property at this time, a member of the public can go and check it out and see that document without having to refer to the building permit and the municipal code. It's all right there in one place. And the third thing that is worth knowing about these is about the design review aspect, which is often where we intersect a lot with the design review boards as a commission. And in our motions, when we make a motion, sometimes we will use language that is something shall be done, the dumpster shall be moved closer to the curb or something along those lines. And I wanted to compliment staff on the reworking of the design part of the conditions of approval. They're much clearer than I've seen them in the past. In the past, they've been vague, and slowly but surely, step by step, they're getting clearer so that the communication between the Planning Commission and the HLC and the ABR and the Single Family Board can be clearer. And in particular, you called out that if a motion from the Planning Commission says the design review shall study or consider such and so, it means just that. They can study it or consider it. It's not enforceable until the Commission has in its motion that something shall be done. So it's worth remembering in motion making by the Commission that the language that we put into a condition of approval carries forward in very specific ways through the design process and as a project gets finished. And it's clearly spelled out in here, and I wanted to compliment you on that. Thanks.
Any other comments from the Commission? Well, I'd like to wrap up. First of all, I totally agree with the comment that was made earlier by Commissioner Jacobs about every project having a sign, construction sign with contact number. I think that does a couple of things. It really helps inform the neighbors and gives them power to kind of monitor or be that sort of eyes on the neighborhood. And it also makes it very apparent, what projects are legal and permitted and those that may not be. So I think it serves a real dual purpose. And then lastly, I think that staff kept the best part of this document for the very last item. It starts on page 43 and rolls into 44, where it really links all the expirations of the different permit aspects of a project together so that they all coincide. I think that's, of all the streamlining you've done, I think this one is the best in the document, and hopefully that will make everybody's lives easier, especially the applicants, because it's really hard with all the different tracks of approvals that go on, especially on the complicated projects. So kudos on that one. Mr. Cato.
I would just like to make sure that I give my thanks to Allison. This has been a Herculean task to go through all the conditions, make sure they're in the right spot, make sure they say what they need to say, make sure that by deleting some of them we don't it's already covered someplace else. So thank you very much. It's really good.
And I will echo that from the Commission. So it will benefit all of us greatly.
Mr. Chair, I do want to make one clarification in your last statement regarding the project signs.
Oh, okay.
One thing to understand is that these conditions of approval come from staff hearing officer projects and planning commission projects. You could have a run-of-the-mill design review project for an addition that doesn't require a modification or any other action by the planning commission.
Has no conditions of approval.
Has no conditions of approval, would not have a construction sign, yet be a completely legal project. So just don't want neighbors running around, if they see something going on, don't see that sign out front, and all of a sudden they think that it's an unpermitted construction.
Point. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, unless there's any other comments, we appreciate the interaction here and good work. Okay, we will move on to our next item, which is a new item. This is the application of Brian Murphy for 1816 State Street. And I believe Allison DeBusk will be giving the staff presentation on that as well.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett and Commissioners. This project site is located at 1816 State Street, and it's currently developed with a hotel. The property is split zoned with a commercial C2 zone at the front of the property, and you can see that in the purpley shade at the bottom here. And the rear half of the project site has a single-family residential R1 zone, and that's shown by this reddish-pink color towards the back. The portions of the project that specifically require Planning Commission approval are the requests to locate parking, a trash enclosure, and a deck in the R1 zoned portion of the property. The project does also include a remodel of the existing hotel and abatement of building code violations. In order to locate the non-residential parking in the R1 zone, a conditional use permit is required. Because the parking is proposed to be located just 2 feet from the south property line, it does require a setback modification. The non-residential trash enclosure and deck are not permitted uses in the R1 zone, and therefore the applicant has requested a CUP to locate these in the R1 zone. Just for the record, staff does not believe that the CUP ordinance includes provisions for those types of uses in the R1 zone, but it is an issue that we'd like feedback from the Planning Commission on. Also, the proposed trash enclosure would be located on the rear property line, which requires a setback modification. This is an aerial photo of the site just so you can visualize where these improvements would go. The proposed deck area would be located at the very back of the property behind the existing hotel. The proposed trash enclosure would be located at the center of this drive aisle for the parking lot against the rear property line. And the proposed parking would be located in this area of the site. Staff supports the request to locate the parking in the R1 portion of the property and also the requested setback modification for that parking. This type of request has been reviewed and approved for several properties in this area, and staff does not believe that it will negatively impact the adjacent properties. However, staff does not support locating the trash enclosure in the setback area due to potential impacts on adjacent residential development, mainly related to odor and noise. Staff believes that an appropriate setback would mitigate these potential impacts. Additionally, in order to locate the non-residential trash in the R1 portion of the property, the Planning Commission would need to determine that the use can be permitted as part of the CUP for the parking area. And finally, staff does not support locating the non-residential deck in the R1 zoned portion of the property. This deck would be intended to serve hotel guests and therefore is not an allowed use in the R1 zone, and staff can find no provision in the CUP ordinance to allow that type of a use. Staff believes that the deck could result in noise and privacy impacts to adjacent neighbors, and therefore staff recommends that that area be returned to the approved planting area as shown on the original plans, or an at-grade patio with adequate landscape screening. This just reiterates staff's recommendation. One thing that I do want to mention, with any approval that may be granted by the Planning Commission today, there are timelines that go along with that. And I do want to point out that because this is an enforcement case, the timelines identified by the enforcement officer would govern the project, and they'd be subject to those and any fines that may go along with it. That concludes staff's report, and I can answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
I think we'll hold our questions. I would like to open public comment. I see we have 2 people from the public that would like to speak today. Oh, I'm sorry. Skip the applicant. Getting ahead of myself. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brian Murphy, the architect on the project. Are we switched over? Thank you. This is Dario Pini, the owner. I'm also a native son, but of Santa Barbara, and a very nervous architect on the project. So, the project is, like Allison was saying, an existing hotel building on State Street. Was built as a travel lodge in the 50s. You'll notice on the existing, or the as-built plan, or original plan rather, there was shown no trash enclosure location, and the parking, while it was shown in the commercial zoned area, not extending back into the residential zone, it doesn't really function, and certainly doesn't comply with current requirements. Again, the site is between Pedregosa and Islay on State Street. It's a balcony corridor motel with 2 stories to State Street, 3 stories stepping back away from State Street. It's located between a medical office building and a gas station on State Street. Again, the 3 stories towards the back, 2 stories towards State Street. Parking looks to have been existing for many, many years back into the residential zone because the number of parking spaces really didn't fit. There was no way to get backing space the way they were configured on the approved plan. Adjacent to us on the, I guess that would be the northeast side, the commercial use is also one of the anomaly sites along State Street there that has the dual zoning, and that's parking toward the back of their lot as well. The neighbor adjacent to us, to the behind us, away from State Street, has a multi-easement, I would assume, access way that runs adjacent to our property. Essentially functions as a roadway. We could ask Peter Hunt exactly what its configuration is. I believe he's here, but let's see. The site's 17,000 square feet site. We're doing a number of improvements to the property. It's a property that has weathered a bit and needs some updating. Essentially, we have 11 basic phases of work that we're proposing, and it has a number of problems that we need to fix. Obviously, one of its problems, or many of its problems, stem from the fact that it has the 2 zones that run through it. Our current zoning is the R1 in the back, the C2 towards State Street. In the final draft of the proposed update for zoning, and I know that we're not supposed to work to the future zoning, but you'll see that in the update plan that is the property is the anomalies will be fixed along State Street, or that's the plan anyway, and that will all be commercial to the back of the property there, and then high density residential, I believe, is behind that, and low density residential behind that. The existing land use patterns are that all those anomaly properties along State Street are currently in commercial use, except the little high density residential section that's kind of landlocked next to the gas station, and the roadway away from State Street to the I guess that would be northeast private roadway or a driveway that essentially functions as a private roadway. So what we're proposing is to legitimize the parking that's existed on the site back in this area, and permit that those 3 additional spaces that are required. Once you incorporate a van accessible space, you're left about 3 shy in terms of parking spaces that work on the front portion of the lot. So we'd like to incorporate that. In this corner, there exists, and it seems to have existed for decades, an existing trash enclosure. Also, in this area, there appears to have also existed an unpermitted deck, also for many decades. So we're proposing to extend back there into that area our parking, rework the parking, shift the trash enclosure over because we need to make it accessible to both to make it accessible to barrier-free access, so that a person in a wheelchair could get back. We've got a man door to the side of the trash enclosure, and a wheelchaired person could get back to that in an accessible manner, and need to make it also accessible to trash pickup when cars are in the parking lot. So we've rearranged the parking just a little bit, extended it back into that R1 zone, and shifted that existing non-permitted trash enclosure over to the center of the parking. Of course, the other problem is that since this is R1 zone, we have a 10-foot setback, and we're asking to let both that trash enclosure and those parking spaces encroach into the residential setback, even though this could someday soon, hopefully, be resolved into an all C2 zone property. But then over in the area of the patio and deck, our proposal is to permit the deck and patio in that back residential area, but clip them back so they're no longer projecting into setbacks, and remove the water heater that projects over the R1 line. On the third floor of the building, we're proposing to enclose what is currently a roof deck area, or a roofed deck area rather. It has a tile roof over it, and we'd like to enclose that for some much needed storage and housekeeping space. There's very little housekeeping space on this property, and the much needed, and this is a very unused portion of the property that there are some storage facilities that have been added without a permit in this area. We'd like to take those out and enclose the whole area and make it our housekeeping area. We also obviously need to provide accessible parking on the site, and barrier-free accessibility to all the portions of the site. Another thing that we're looking to do is to expand the width of the balcony corridor, and thereby create some little sitting areas in front of the second-story units along that corridor, where the corridor bumps out. Oops, here, the walkway would be out in that area, and these little private courtyards, or semi-private courtyards with a low plastered wall around them, would give you a little area to sit and maybe have some breakfast or enjoy the sun. It is south-facing the balcony corridor, and that could be a pleasant spot to sit and look at the view of the city. Another area that the building is currently lacking and needs some help is that the lobby is minuscule, and we're looking to add a small addition. 62 square feet is about all we're able to get in there, but it would help tremendously that lobby function. It's so small you can barely get in, and if there are two people in there, you can barely turn around. So also with that, we're looking to generally upgrade the look of the building, give the entire building a facade remodel, add a tower element to the State Street side of the building. We have no real interior square footage to the tower element. It's largely aesthetic, and it creates a sense of entry to the project. You come up, the new replaced entry stair comes up through the tower and into the lobby area. In the back, where we're proposing to keep the deck and patio areas, the grade of the existing site slopes about 6 feet across the site, and in the back where we have that deck, the deck steps up from the grade about 1.5 feet, and so we end up with a deck at that back area that is about 6 feet above the floor level of the first floor of the existing motel. The patio area is about 2 feet above that, but this site generally slopes to that on a north-south direction, and that's the highest corner there, and our deck is about 18 inches above the grade. And obviously we would be looking to minimize our runoff impacts, and would be incorporating permeable pavers and a multi-pronged system of taking our runoff water, putting it into cascading cisterns under the planters, and a number of techniques to minimize the water. We'd be re-landscaping as well, I know that the staff is not recommending that you approve the trash enclosure, stepping into that residential area, and especially the residential setback there. Again, I think it's important to note that potentially this site should be rezoned to be all commercial, but perhaps even more importantly is that private driveway behind us actually acts as a private road, and the trash enclosure that has existed probably for decades now is quite invisible back in that corner, it seems. And certainly is the most efficient place for our use. Seems to really present no real problem. There's only a couple of locations that we can put a trash enclosure on this site. One possibility that staff was suggesting was perhaps over here. The size of the trash enclosure would essentially take up 3 spaces. Staff was saying it might take 2, but you really have to have more space than that, and you also needed a man door, so we'd have to relocate 3 spaces. We'd end up with considerably more parking back in the R1 zone. We also have 3 stories here with a roof deck over this portion that's 2 stories and a roof deck. So the entire motel would be looking down into the trash enclosure, which is never a good condition. We'd also need to provide an accessible route to the trash enclosure, so we'd have to have a route with warning strips and such to get an accessible way over there, which is never a recommended path to go through a parking lot. You always want to keep it without crossing traffic, if at all possible. The only other location that I really see for that trash enclosure is again in the R1 zone, but perhaps out of the setback, again it provides such close proximity to the motel balcony corridors and roof decks that I really think it compromises the viability of some of those motel rooms, and seems that to me that this back area in here makes much more sense for everyone, and really doesn't seem to impact this essentially roadway use that runs behind it. I think that the project has a number of benefits for the neighborhood. We certainly would be updating the building that's pretty worn out at present, and we're anxious to do that. We really want to create something that is much more appealing to tourists that come in and are looking for somewhere on that upper end of State Street to stay. It's a perfect location for being almost downtown and within walking distance of city functions when tourists come. It's a great location to be walking to public events from. We ask for your approval of these items and think that while the new plan update hasn't gone into effect and may not. You never know. But we feel that this is these are appropriate uses for this property, and if those updates were in effect, would all be uses that would be perfectly permitted within that future zoning. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very thorough presentation, and we appreciate seeing the alternates that were not in our package. So, before I open public comment, I do want to ask the Commission, though, if there's been any ex parte communication. Okay, seeing none, I would like to announce that I did have communication with both John Watson and Peter Hunt, who are here to speak today. And it looks like we also have another speaker as well. So with that, I will open public comment, 2 minutes each, and I will start with Peter Hunt.
Hello, I'm Peter Hunt. I'm an architect, and I was instrumental in, with Mr. Lloyd Tupper in changing the granting a condominium conversion on this property about 5 years ago. What happened in that event was the City Council took this non-conforming use in 1947 and said, yes, you can have 5 bungalows there, and consequently that allowed the conversion of these bungalows, which were built in 1918, to become condominiums. And in the course of doing that, I learned a lot about the site. I talked to Mr. Tupper today and told him about the what's being proposed here, and when we discussed it and what his interests are. He still owns 3 of those units, and as of a month ago, he still owned all 5 of them. So even though it happened 5 years ago, they essentially have remained rental properties. And I don't know if you're familiar with it. Many of you here were on that commission then, but they're very high-quality buildings. First of all, it's very good in the interests of Santa Barbarans and as a Santa Barbaran. This motel is a fantastic feature to have close to downtown. It's good for our commerce. It's good for the city, and provides people to the opportunity, tourists, to walk downtown. Secondly, it's true. It's been functioning, the R1 portion, as a commercial area, and that's the way it is, and very likely. One way or another, it will probably have its general plan designation changed and zoning changed. The interest of the before I talk about Mr. Tupper and his interest, as a community member, we want to see the people that are at the motel to be able to park on the motel property rather than on the street. And Islay Street is highly impacted, probably more so due to the people that live there than businesses in the area or whoever parking there, even though it is only 90-minute parking. And so we want to see, I want to see, as a member of the community, as many parking spaces as possible on the site, so that we keep them off the streets. Secondly, it's in our interest to see as high quality a project here as possible. So certainly we want to encourage the applicant and Brian Murphy, one of the better architects in Santa Barbara, to be able to realize their goal here. The lane, the property.
If you could
directly
wrap up soon.
We've got to wrap up. It's the interest that we stop noise from the motel as a commercial use, and stop odor, if there is any odor, from a trash enclosure. And we'd like to see the trash enclosure have a roof on it. And so in the alternative site proposal, if you look on the left, we'd like to see that one more closely approximates the goals we'd like. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, John Watson, to be followed by Jeff Bard.
I'm John Watson. I have also had extensive experience with Mr. Tupper, and he called me about this about a week ago. I've had a chance to meet on the site. And do we get the alternatives up there? Mr. Tupper and the new owners of the last 2 units, which are the ones that are just sold, are concerned about the trash enclosure so close to their property. So either of the alternatives that Brian laid out in the upper left-hand corner over to the right would be preferable to the neighbors, at least the ones that I represent. And it seems to me, Brian, that it's not really an issue about looking down on it. You've done a very nice job on the hotel. It's just a matter of design to get a nice roof on that thing, look down on it. It can be a cute little something that's in the landscape. It doesn't have to be just trash cans that you look down on. So, yes, it's going to be maybe slightly more expensive, but I think it could actually be an asset to the property. So with that, we'd like to thank them for doing the upgrades to the property and hope that they can find a solution to move that trash enclosure out of the setback so it reduces the modification and is, in our opinion, better for the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and our last speaker is Jeff Bard.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, actually I probably would like to use the 2 minutes allotted because some other issues have come to mind. I'm familiar with the neighborhood. I'm a member of Trinity Episcopal Church, and I frequently, actually almost every night, used to walk by the property with my girlfriend, and it's a lovely neighborhood. And I appreciate the good upkeep and the concern for the property that everyone who spoke before me has shown. And with that in mind, I would, regarding the non-compliant matters that were mentioned, I would certainly urge kind of a reasonableness and urge careful consideration of site-specific on-the-ground particulars, which were in particular you mentioned regarding the existing dumpster, which in the vernacular we would say is kind of grandfathered. But I'm not an attorney, a land use attorney, nor am I an expert. So I will defer, of course, to your decision. I realize that this is not an enforcement action per se, but I do urge that general attitude as commonly expressed, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against others. If this is a case of a property which was taken out of local resident use and at least some units placed into tourist industry use, not to, pick on the property, but it would be part of the general economic trend, which has contributed to the homelessness that we observe, which has been so controversial before this commission lately. And so, again, I would reiterate, the old saw, forgive us our trespasses, we forgive those trespass against us. There are some non-compliant matters. I hope there are not a lot of stiff fines or bureaucratic red tape that get in the way of common sense. And I would extend that across all classes and urge the commission to remember justice is blind. And we routinely in the real estate industry see violations that are more or less overlooked. And I think we need to remember to apply that equally to the poor who are before you on some of the other issues. So I think that pretty well wraps it up, and thank you for your diligence, all of you.
Thank you. With that, I will close public comment. I'll bring it back to the commission for questions. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vincent, can you help me out just and quickly start me even thinking about a CUP, because the staff report kind of says no way, and then says, but if you want to go in that direction, and certainly we've had a couple of them here before where we've discussed what can and can't be done, and we've moaned and groaned about how out years affect that. And so I'd just like your comments on what your thoughts are on whether this would actually be considered for a CUP from your perspective.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I think I would take the two items that the applicant is asking for as a conditional use. First is the deck, and second would be maybe we can bifurcate it into three different parts. First, the deck that is serving a commercial use. Second, the commercial or non-residential parking. And third, the non-residential trash enclosure. Regarding the deck, I've looked at the conditional use chapter of the municipal code, as has staff, and I can't find a location that describes a commercially used deck within a residentially zoned area as a use that is available for a conditional use permit. To back up for just a second, reminding the commission, in every zone there is a certain list of allowed uses. Then there's another list of uses that might be allowed if granted a conditional use permit. But it has to be one of those enumerated lists. I think it goes up to AA or BB. We have about 28 different categories of conditional uses that the Planning Commission may consider for granting a conditional use permit. I can't find a category that covers the non-residentially related deck in a residential zone. Skipping now to the other two uses. The request for a conditional use permit to allow the residentially zoned area for non-residential parking. That's clearly an allowed use or an allowed conditional use. You may grant a conditional use permit to use residentially zoned land to serve a non-residential parking use. Let's now jump to the last category of the three. The trash enclosure that serves a non-residential use. It's not clear, we don't have a clear category that says trash enclosure for serving a non-residential use. However, I think we've all experienced trash enclosures in the parking area of a non-residential use. So what I would say is it's up to this commission in its prerogative to decide whether or not a trash enclosure and the trash area of a non-residential use, does that fall within the generally the acceptable uses of a non-residential parking area? And I can see arguments on both sides. And so I'm going to leave it up to you, Seven, to figure it out, whether it's better to consider that as part of the various numbers of things that occur in non-residential parking areas or not.
Thank you. Mr. Busk, so if, and I know we spent a lot of time Tuesday talking about what ifs in the general plan, but if this was a C2 zone, then what would the presence of that deck mean right now?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Jordan, if you take a look at the screen, I do have the setback requirements in the C2 zone. So it would depend on where the new C2 zone line ends or begins, and we don't have that exact information at this point in time. But as you can see, for interior setbacks, all buildings and structures adjacent to a residential zone have to be 10 feet or 1/2 the building height, whichever is greater. If it's adjacent to a non-residential zone, then no setback is required. So it would depend on where the residential zone starts.
But we'd presume that worst or best, the residential zone would be on the fence line by the east driveway, right? I mean, it certainly wouldn't be any farther out than that.
One thing that is a little bit unique about this property is that a portion of the property does extend into the driveway, so that may affect it slightly. And I can put up the site plan if you want to take a look at that.
We're talking feet, several feet, right?
Right.
Okay. And then does the current, and this may be to Mr. Murphy, does the current trash service entail a truck driving through the lot to the enclosure, or are the containers just rolled out to the street? Okay.
Could you repeat that answer just so that we could all hear?
Sorry, they are rolled out.
Rolled out. Great,
also, if I could for 1 second, there are full-size drawings if that would help the board. I know you were saying that those were hard to read. I have 7 sets of them up there if you'd like to see them. And I forgot to mention also that we are proposing a block wall, an 8-foot tall block wall along that
Okay. I
property
think
edge.
the full-size sets would really help, if Danny can pass those out. Go ahead, Mr. Jordan.
I think that's pretty much all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Ms. Larson's light was on before me, so I'm going to,
Okay.
out of respect for that.
Okay.
That's okay?
Ms. Larson.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. I just, it was the tiny plans I was looking at, but I didn't see a landscape plan. Is there a landscape plan? It's the tiny plans in the dark. I want to add that part. So
Next to last sheet, I believe.
next to the last sheet. Okay, thank you. That was my question.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vincent, back to you for a moment, if you would, please. Mr. Vincent, do you have any advice for us on the do's and don'ts of speculating on zoning pertaining to Plan Santa Barbara's approval relative to this project?
The Planning Commission's charge is to implement the zoning and general plan as they exist. Attempting to divine what the general plan or future zoning will look like, as you've experienced in the Plan Santa Barbara, is difficult, and none of us sitting here now can really divine that. Basically, your charge is to implement the zoning and the general plan as they exist today.
Okay, thank you. Ms. DeBus, could you describe perhaps in a little more detail, both for the Commission as well as the public, the pending enforcement action that we should all be aware of?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Schwartz, in December of 2008, an enforcement case was opened with several violations noted on the property, and I can read through those. I think there's about 10. The first is the raised deck, block walls, and stairs at the rear of the property built without permit, and an associated mechanical room for the spa was being added without permit. Number 2, the covered balcony area on the 3rd floor had been enclosed without permits. Number 3, zero clearance gas heaters and associated exterior vents were installed in each guest room. Number 4, improperly installed water heater at rear of building. Number 5, hazardous electrical existing in the lower floor laundry room. Number 6, brick retaining wall on the right front of the driveway is failing. Number 7, portion of the deck and trellis built within the 5-foot side yard setbacks, and that's how the deck exists today. And as was pointed out at the site visit, the proposal is to pull that deck in to meet the 10-foot interior setback. Violation number 8 was dilapidation on the property, decorative columns deteriorating, missing and torn window screens, and missing window box on the front of the building. And that is the extent of the violations that were noted as part of that enforcement case.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Murphy, I think my next questions are for you, please. When the deck in the back was built with the hot tub that we saw on our site visit, first of all, when was that constructed?
We don't know exactly when the original deck was built back there. The owner acquired the property. There was a deck that existed back there for many years, it appeared. It had dilapidated severely, and he essentially went to rebuild it, and that's the result. The enforcement case resulted from that rebuilding. And you.
It's there, but it's not functional.
The hot tub is there but non-functional and will be removed.
And when was the hot tub placed on the deck?
When you bought it?
When we bought the property. It was about 4 years ago, I guess.
Approximately 4 years ago.
Okay, so that would be around the time when your client acquired the purchased the property? Yes. Okay. But those cinder block walls, they were constructed subsequent to the property being acquired 6 years ago?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of enclosing that area on, I guess it's the 2nd floor. I don't know if you can put that slide back up. Is it the 2nd or the 3rd floor?
3rd floor.
The 3rd
yes.
floor?
Uh-huh.
Was there any consideration in moving what I'll call back of house or housekeeping needs outside of the structure or the building to the back somewhere, as opposed to utilizing the very valuable space that you have for the overnight visitors?
I believe the site is impacted, and we could not add any square footage to the building, is my understanding.
Is that correct, Ms. DeBose?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Schwartz, the existing hotel goes to the edge of the C1 zone, so no additional space could be added beyond that. In terms of Measure E square footage, there is a little bit left, not a lot.
In other words, that shed that we saw that I asked you about at our site visit that I think is unpermitted and I think needs to come down, but that area of the property, is that within the C1? Or now are we moving into the C2 rather? Are we moving into the R1 there?
Commissioner Schwartz, we believe that is in the R1 zone.
I see. Okay, so you really are very cramped for housekeeping space.
Very constrained.
Okay.
There actually is currently on the site some of the existing kitchens. Several of the units were built with kitchens, and some of them are actually functioning as housekeeping space because there just is none. So those will be converted back to the way they originally were. But currently the maid staff has nowhere else to wash mops and such. So
The trash enclosure. Do you have any comments for us on what would be necessary and advantages, disadvantages to the property owner in moving that trash enclosure elsewhere into the C2 zone with beautification around as an enclosure, as has been done in town on other properties, commercial properties?
I think that we could incorporate it as I've shown on alternate Plan B, I believe, into the C2 zone. The only problem that we have with that is that it ends up sort of in the middle of the parking lot. The entire motel sort of looks down on it. It's a part of our view from all the balcony corridors and all the roof decks. We really feel that it makes a much better location where it is, essentially, but we have to have access to it, so we actually have to shift it over. We'd love to leave it exactly where it is, but that's not an option in terms of trash pickup because it's not accessible there.
Could you clarify for me why in the middle as opposed to up front if it could be properly screened, let's say?
So
maybe I'm not
I guess
envisioning the property. I don't know if I need to look at.
Well, wherever we put it in the C2 zone, we have to relocate parking. It essentially takes 3 parking spaces. I'd be loath to put it too close to State Street, just so that your first impression when you come into the project, I would hate to have it be a trash enclosure.
So I'm looking at your drawings here. You have 25 units in the building. Is that still correct?
That's correct.
Where there used to be originally the studio apartments and the motel as a travel lodge, but now all of them have been converted to 25 hotel rooms or motel rooms. So I'm trying to pick out the 25 parking spaces. Do you just have 25 now?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay, and that spans the C2 and the R1.
Yes.
I think that's it for the moment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, too, am concerned about the trash enclosure and its location. There was a slide that showed an alternative location. If we could see that again.
That's also the last sheet of your hard copy there. Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's easier to look at the plans than it is the screen, but
Yeah,
it's
the
the
screen.
same.
Yeah, that is very. Aside from aesthetic concerns, what are the disadvantages to the motel to have it in the further down on the side where there's a gas station, and you know it's not going to be impacting that use? It's also C2. What are the reasons not to have it there?
Largely because it then becomes a part of the view corridor of the motel units, and the circulation around the site everyone is looking at, the motel is essentially focused on a trash enclosure, almost as if it were in the middle of the courtyard.
On the other hand, I've seen some very attractive trash enclosures, and it would obviously, I think if it were to be in this location, it would need to have a roof on it of some kind, and
We'd be happy to put a roof on it in any location.
Okay.
And a large wall behind it, certainly.
And it seems to me, given that this is a motel and people are coming and going, while on the other hand, with the back, it is where people are homeowners. Whatever impact, I think it'd be better to have it on the gas station rather than the homeowners. I recognize there's a driveway between it and the houses behind the property, but that would be my preference.
Ms. Larson, your light is on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things I noticed on our site visit was a vending machine outside. Did your plans, I'm looking at the bigger plans now, but on the little plans, I didn't see anything about enclosed vending.
That would move into the lobby once we have space for it.
Inside the lobby.
Yes.
Any laundry?
What's that? Oh, we have laundry. What did she ask? I'm sorry, what was the question?
Any laundry for your motel customers? Sometimes.
No, we don't have on-site laundry.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions from the commission, I have a couple. First of all, I think I got some clarity from the applicant presentation, but I'm a little bit unclear because we're looking at several documents. I don't believe that the alternates were part of the submittal, even though they were in your presentation, and now they're also in our set of plans. I appreciate the fact that they're in there. Is the submittal what your site plan is indicating, which is both a new patio and a new deck?
Yes.
But without the spa?
Yes.
And the alternates are not what we're considering unless we decide to go there, but you put them in for our reference?
Yes, for your reference and in response to staff's.
Okay, because it was unclear even from our site visit what's intended, what's to remain, what goes away, so that helps.
We would much prefer it as it's proposed and feel that works the best, but.
So what you're proposing is still the first sheet of the plans?
Exactly.
Okay. And then for staff, can you clarify the difference between what is proposed where we have both a new patio, which I would assume would be some sort of on-grade paving, whether it's permeable or not, and a deck, which is a raised wood platform, which is actually a structure that has to comply with setbacks, versus the alternates that I think just show patio. I don't think there's any deck associated with either of those alternates. So if the patio is on grade, I would assume that a patio is compliant with what would be allowed in a garden. Would those be subject to setback requirements, or is on grade okay?
Chair Bartlett, if the patio is on grade, then there would be no setback requirements.
Okay. All right. Well,
Mr. Chair, could you, if I may ask one of your questions also
Okay.
for me, is and when you get back in that corner, which grade are we talking about? Are we talking about the grade that's holding the current deck, the grade in the next set of moats and grade, or the grade back down to the parking lot level? Because there's actually 3 grades there, right?
Yes.
3 enough?
Well,
Yeah. Okay.
it would be on dirt, wherever the dirt is.
The existing dirt in that back corner, would that be what your question is?
Yes,
Okay.
and
All right.
if you really look at it on site where the fence is, it's the same dirt level on either side of the fence. So
That corner, yeah.
The dirt has not been raised, but the elevated deck was. So
Thanks.
okay,
Exactly.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have another question. Mr. Murphy, and going back to the site plan here, can you talk a little bit about the intended use for the patio versus the deck, and why both?
The intended use was just as a sitting area, area to be out in the sun, to have a table and chair out there, to have just a little quiet area for people to enjoy the outdoors. And the idea of multiple areas was to create little private zones. So it wasn't a big patio with a big party going on. It was for people to sit individually and quietly enjoy the outdoors.
So this is to augment some of the roof deck lounging area. I think that's what you're calling it here, second story area with roof deck above.
Right, those are existing and they are utilized, and people like to sit out there in the sun. But it's nicer at times to commune with nature a little bit and be out in the landscaping. The roof decks are nice but fairly vacant area.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then one last question for staff. If we were to consider one of the applicants' alternates that have been presented, that would do away with the necessity for modification number 2, which was the trash enclosure in the interior setback, correct?
That is correct.
Well, actually, the left alternative would. The right one, it's still within a setback, right?
The alternative A, the trash enclosure is located more than 10 feet from the interior property line.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, ready for comments? Mr. Schwartz. I'm Mr. Jordan. I've got my...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Got notes too many places uncovered by these plans. Sorry. Well, generally, however we got here, I think one of the things that's obvious to me is that the changes that have taken place in that northeast corner improperly have constrained this lot. And one of the alternatives that I see that is not even raised here is that if that northeast corner was brought down to parking lot grade, that you would be able to pick up the parking spots and trash enclosures somewhere on the lot. So I don't know if there's any traction for that, but that's one of the alternatives I see. Maybe not a pleasant one, but one of them. I am not leaning towards that deck remaining in any shape or form. I agree with staff's recommendation that area go back to some definition of patio. I'm still concerned about what that grade would be, that the grade that's there, if the deck was to go away, still might be too high, and that obviously with the way the grade steps up there in a structured manner, the grade could be brought back down to meet the middle grade between the parking lot and the deck grade, so to speak, and that might when people are gathering back there and to whatever happens in the future, that might mitigate some of the potential and probable noise issues that the residents would feel on the other side of the fence. Given also that the trash service is roll-out cans, I really see no reason that you can't start working with the entire lot for some type of enclosure. If that's the way I understand it, that Marburg or Allied don't have to drive a truck to the back of the lot, but their guys are just running through the lot and then rolling the cans out. I would be much more in favor of even losing a parking spot or two and letting them have that, lowering the requirement for a parking lot or two and moving the trash enclosure somewhere up near the front of the property. Even so far as to say, to me, the most unpleasant parking spots on that lot right now have to be number 1, 2, and 3, the first 3 coming in, because of the grade, because of the backing up to the lobby part of the building, and because of the egress coming in and out of the driveway that you'd have to watch for. And I could make a case that you could live without those parking lots. You could design something there that was aesthetic, and if I'm missing a setback rule there, then that all goes away. But you'd just drive through it, be past it, and it might be pleasant, something pleasant to look at. I think that gets us started. I'll be interested to hear what everybody else thinks about that going forward, and then maybe have some more comments.
Great, thank you. Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it would be helpful for this property to be upgraded, as Mr. Watson has articulated in his public comment. I think it could certainly add to the feel of not only the parcel but improvement of the block as well. And I'm of a like mind to Mr. Jordan regarding the relocation of the parking lot. The trash. I simply cannot support modification number 1. Modification number 2 in the staff report because I just don't think it's the intent of the zoning that we have to allow us to place a trash enclosure so close to residential zones and residential uses. On the conditional use permit, I'm worried that that is a very slippery slope. It's someplace we haven't been before, and I'm very supportive of staff's perspective, and I see it as setting somewhat of a negative precedent that I don't feel comfortable with. So I couldn't support the CUP, but I do think there's a project here that's a good project that could go forward with the granting of the modification to allow the parking, because I think it's important to this type of use to have sufficient parking. It's got a transient use, so this is not like somebody coming to work every Monday through Friday where they might be able to arrange for alternative travel modes to get to and from work or that type of thing. So I don't think this is worth trying to squeeze the parking too much further. Although if the applicant is comfortable with one less parking space as Mr. Jordan has suggested, I wouldn't be against that. But I think this requires a little bit different treatment than the Commission has taken on some of the other projects along the State Street spine. So if you could get a project that only needed a modification, I could see for parking into that interior setback, I could see making some kind of supportive finding. But I'm looking to a real clear indication of necessity as being absolutely necessary for an appropriate improvement of the property. I would be further encouraged by seeing some more green building and energy conservation measures, whether it's voltaics on the roof or something else. I know there's not necessarily a clear nexus, but from a good design standpoint, I think it would be worthwhile to look at that closely and see if this project could incorporate something like that.
Thank you. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Commissioners Jordan and Justice about the parking. I can, in the R1 portion, I can live with that. I can't live with, as I mentioned before, with the trash back there. And looking at the elevations, there's a retaining wall. Oh, I need to ask. There's a 10-foot setback if it's in the back, but on the side where, how much of a setback from the property line does there need to be for the trash enclosure if it's on the adjoining C2 zone?
Chair Bartlett and Commissioner Lodge, if the trash enclosure is on the C2 portion of the lot, even if it's adjoining that R1 section, there would be no setback.
Well, then it would take much less space, as I read it, the page that shows the alternative location. It could be much closer to the fence, could it not? Okay, well, I see no reason, frankly, why it couldn't even be at the front. I'm sure Mr. Murphy is talented enough to design a facade on that enclosure that fits with what is proposed for the facade of the building itself. And in any event, let's put it somewhere on the C2 side And I think it could be made more convenient for the trash people, and the parking would all be together. And unless there's a palm tree, that's a street palm tree in the elevation, is that correct? On the
Yes.
Yeah, and the tree behind it, is that on the property? There's what looks like might be a.
No, those are both street trees.
Those are both street trees. Okay, so there wouldn't be any. I mean, they would be screening it too.
The palms are street trees. The pepper tree behind it is on the neighbor's property.
It's on the neighbor's property. Okay, so it wouldn't affect that then. Okay, well, and I certainly couldn't support any kind of permission for what exists in the back corner, northeast corner. And as I recall, Mr. Murphy, coming from the parking lot into the lower part of that area, there are a few steps up.
Yes, it's about
And
2
then
feet
you
above.
Okay, and then you go back into it, and then there are the steps up onto the deck.
Another 4 foot of rise to the roof, to the deck.
Okay, so it would be, well, and check with staff, the finished grade then would be the level of going up the 2 steps from the parking lot level. Is that what would happen?
Existing grade back there is several steps above that because the lot slopes to that back corner.
Oh, okay.
Unless we graded it out, but to follow to put it at natural grade, it'd probably be another 3 feet up at least, or 2.5 feet rather.
But you could take advantage of that and create little separate areas
Little levels.
on the dirt. Okay. All right. And then a question, I don't even know if this has anything to do with what's before us, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I was shocked to read that 0 clearance gas heaters and associated exterior vents have been installed in each guest room without permit. That must have been done by an unlicensed contractor? I mean, and I wonder, how does the city make sure? I mean, that can be serious to somebody's health. And is there some way the city can make sure that doesn't happen again?
I can comment on that.
Chair Bartlett.
Vent heaters, they're called debonair heaters, and they replaced the old ones, which were extremely toxic. So the gas company came out and made sure that everyone was functioning correctly. And they're totally approved. You see them all over town, the direct vents.
Okay, so they are a different type and a newer type, and there aren't the health issues connected with it. All right, thank you very much.
Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. Like my colleagues, I can find support for the parking modification, but not for the conditional use permit route. And I'd like to see the trash enclosure only allowed in the C2 portion of the property. And just as a little background to that, I do know this neighborhood. I lived just off of Rossier Lane when I first moved to Santa Barbara, and the parking in this area is very impacted by downtown employees and by any number of people. So any ability to keep as much parking on site as possible is well worth the effort. And also, I've seen the changes in the neighborhoods. When I lived there, what's now the 15 East Islay bungalows were kind of ratty little shacks. They were not beautiful, and I think they were on 7 individual lots. They were not coordinated in any way. They were kind of a weed patch. And the project that was undertaken there to fix them up and to get a tentative subdivision map to make it into condos, that project could have gone a different way. It could have been 2 or 3 stories high. It could have been a big, bulky thing with podium parking. But the project direction was to make it charming and human scale and historically beautiful. And so I see that in the next proper step for this neighborhood is to keep it charming and human scale, and certainly not to continue using the back as a area for trash dumpsters and so on, but to really do it upright. I like the direction the design is going in. The timing is definitely right to fix up this building. And I think that your alternate B for the dumpster is a good alternative. The dumpster isn't just where the trash haulers go to and from. It's also where your housekeeping staff goes, and it's where hotel guests might go. It has a kind of an active life throughout the day, not just when the guys come to haul away the trash. So putting it right up front is not necessarily a great idea because the housekeeping staff would have to be going to and from to take the stuff they clean up out of the hotel rooms. So I think the alternate that you had there for the southeast part of the property was a pretty good solution, and I would certainly support following that design idea. And I cannot support the roof deck on the back of the property. Thanks.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I certainly think this property is probably long overdue for both beautification, three things: beautification, overall, connecting it visually and with some landscaping improvements into the residential community behind it, and also bringing it up to code. I am very concerned about the violations that Ms. DeBusk identified, and I'll be looking closely once this project moves forward regarding implementation and adherence, which leads me to very cautiously look at your plan, Mr. Murphy. Now, I think it's one thing for a property owner that's acquired a property to unknowingly inherit some unpermitted functions on the property, and we've had that come to us this year on the residential side, not commercial. But this list is somewhat alarming for me. So any further changes on the property, whether or not I conceptually think they could be of benefit, I'm looking very carefully at in terms of correct follow-through, quite frankly. So having said that, let me talk about trash enclosure, because that's a hot topic today, as it often is with these sorts of projects. When I think of Ms. Jacobs' comments about the location also needing to synchronize with housekeeping, that makes sense to me, and yet I'm wondering where then that would be, because I think you're looking to locate housekeeping in the newly enclosed area on the third floor, which means your housekeeping staff is going to be, going to every room on every floor and then removing whatever items need to be removed to trash somewhere on the property, whether it's still at the back, what would that be, northeast portion of it, or moved up front. So it's almost equidistant, it seems to me. I mean, is the blue on the first page of the site plan the newly proposed enclosed area? Let's see, addition, third floor, roof area. Maybe that's not it.
Yes.
It
On
is
the
that?
site plan,
This is the blue shaded area?
On the site plan, it shows where the area would be enclosed on the third floor. Yes, that's the blue.
Okay. So it's almost as though it's equidistant in a way from where it is currently in the northeast corner of the property to, if it were moved up front to where it says planter, right at the front of the property. I mean, the housekeeping either has to go to the back and almost the same distance going to the front, as you've proposed where housekeeping would be located. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Just in terms of the location on the property.
Yes, although they tend to be out there with their carts. I've watched them function, and they're out with their carts emptying the trash at the trash enclosure. They spend a fair amount of time there with the cart sitting there, and they're back and forth a bit to it. If that were to the front of the lot, there's quite a bit of activity, like you say, around that trash enclosure when they're cleaning the rooms.
I am inclined to recommend that we that you move the trash enclosure out of the R1. And I think it's unfortunate that it's been there as long as it has, and what can we do? This is a split zone property at this point, and we don't know into the future, as Mr. Vincent has advised us. We can't speculate and make decisions on what could be. That's a slippery slope for us, and I think that would be inappropriate on our part. So I'm going to recommend that we move the trash enclosure out, and I think that there is a way to make it visually acceptable. I won't say appealing, but visually acceptable. There are many examples in town. If you move it up front, in the corner next to where the gas station is. I don't know if you've had any feedback from your trash hauler as to the difficulties they may have had. It also seems to me that every week when you have to pull the trash bins from the back of the property down the driveway in front of all those rooms to the front, I can't imagine how that's attractive or appealing to your guests either. So just something for you to consider. I'm not trying to tell you how you run your business in that regard. Then lastly, regarding the patio and the deck, and from our site visit, I think to have two areas in the back for guest privileges or leisure is overreaching in this area, in this part of the lot. Unfortunately for you, it's a very constrained lot. It does back up to a very quiet residential area, and I could easily see, without very aggressive on-site management on your part, depending upon the kind of guests you have come to the motel, there could be too much noise, and this could really infringe, I think, on the quietude of the residential neighborhood right behind you. So I'm not inclined to support keeping the deck there, and I won't comment about grading. I know that's a very expensive proposition, so leave that for another comment. And I understand, however, that you'd like some additional space, and this is very common on these motel-hotel properties, to have some outdoor space for lingering, and maybe there's little wine and cheese, or, you know, they've gotten something from a nice store, Cantwell's or elsewhere, they're bringing it up to the motel, and they want to just enjoy the out-of-doors, which is what Santa Barbara is so known for. So I can appreciate that somewhere other than right outside the motel room, the second or third floor, you want another area, and it seems to me that if designed properly with very attractive landscaping, that patio area could be made to function that way and to be used in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to say, great that we're getting a finger planter in that parking lot, and some tree wells and some trees, and bringing that up to more standard. I think that will really benefit, especially when you think of the third floor view. Those trees are going to soften everything. I mean, if you're looking at trash, you're looking at a gas station. So that will really make a big difference. I think it's great to, enforcement abatement is a giant pain, but it's sort of like cutting your wisdom teeth over and over. You got to do it at some time or another. And upgrading the facility, he could just abate these things and say, okay, we're doing it. But to also upgrade the facility, thank you very much for doing that. I think that's very important. With regards to the trash, I want to help you out. The trash shouldn't be in the front because that's where registration takes place. There's so much that goes on in the front, right at that entry. I think that putting trash at the entry would choke things up horribly and just make it real difficult for people coming to enter. You've got a few parking spaces there to enter, run in. You know, they're probably timed for 15 or 30 minutes or something so you can get registered, and then you move on to where your room is and your assigned parking or whatever. So I don't think the front is really the appropriate spot for the trash. But on the other hand, I do think it belongs in the C2. So, and I wish in our tiny plans, that we'd had the alternate to study, because I'm more inclined for the, wait a minute, I want to say the right one, for say Plan B or a study like that. Also, I really believe in roofing trash. It's very helpful, keeps the vermin out, keeps the birds out, and keeps the trash where it belongs. So regardless of where you put it and who's looking at it, I know you can make it attractive and include a roof. I am not in support of a CUP for this. I agree with Mr. Joseph. I think it's a slippery slope. But I can support a mod for the parking in the R1. And I think that's just about got it. But I'm so glad that you're upgrading this facility. It's certainly long, long overdue. And I think what you're doing will be great. And it's in a great spot, like as Ms. Schwartz said. You know, I could just, that was going to be part of my comment. I can see a patio out somewhere, a quiet patio, maybe with a table or two tables and an umbrella and Cantwell's lunch spread out for a family. I can certainly see that. In that type of use. And then perhaps you restrict it as for time. You know, you say, okay, after 9 o'clock this patio is not used. So there's not a drinking party out there every night or, you know, that sort of thing going on. But you can take care of that internally. So those are my comments. I'm happy about the trees, happy about the upgrade. So, yeah, those are my comments. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, finally my turn. First of all, thank you for really taking a more holistic look at the whole project rather than just dealing with the list that was on an inspector's report. So I think it will be a real enhancement to that area of State Street. With that being said, I'd like a point of clarity with staff because what I'm hearing from my colleagues is confusing me. First of all, I'm hearing I can't support a mod, but I want the parking on the R1. Well, I don't think, or they can't support a CUP, but you can't get the parking on the R1 unless you do a CUP. So I need to understand what they really mean because they can't have it both ways. So anyway, I think there's some real confusion, and I think that needs to be dealt with. So I think we're going to have some more discussion relative to that. But anyway, my position is that I think the applicant should pursue something similar to your alternate B, but rework the trash enclosure so that you don't have that unrequired 10-foot setback on that, what would that be, the southerly property line. Just go ahead and move it to the property line against the gas station. And probably, I would suggest rotating the trash enclosure the other way so that you don't lose as much parking. So I think we would end up probably having to do a parking mod to reduce parking by, you know, 1 or 2 stalls or whatever number you come up with. But we wouldn't have to have a mod to have the trash enclosure within the interior yard setback. So we're sort of trading one mod for another, but it keeps it away from the neighbors, and I think it keeps it as far away from the rooms as possible. And I agree with Commissioner Larson. I'd like to see you integrate some sort of a roof on that. I think it would look like a nice little structure and kind of almost lead you into the back garden area portion of the site. So it makes it feel like you're entering a new experience. So I could support the CUP for the parking on the R1. I think it would be a real stretch to not have any parking on the R1 and keep the trash enclosure on the C2 lot. I think you'd probably be eliminating at least 4 or 5 parking stalls. Right now you have 1 per hotel room, and you're minimal already. You're already not even meeting the requirements. So it would be tough, I think, to eliminate that many. So I would be willing to support the CUP for the parking in the R1, which is similar to exact same situation that we have to the south and to the north on the adjacent 2 properties. And I'm not hearing opposition from the residential neighbors to the east on that aspect. I think as long as the trash and the sound issues are dealt with, this would, I think, give them, you know, a lot more of a landscape buffer and so forth. In terms of the deck and patio as your proposal lays out, I couldn't support the deck. I could support a patio that is really toned down and feels like it's part of a garden rather than a big main feature in itself. I think you want more of a garden experience for your guests to go relax. So I think if you do it that way and keep them at grade so the grade is not higher than the adjacent properties. And I appreciate the fact that you're proposing the 8-foot plastered decorative wall along that east property line. I think that's really going to help with the noise issues for the neighbors. And having walked to the other side on the private driveway, it's also then going to open up the opportunity for those neighbors to actually have more room to landscape and continue their hedging along that driveway, because right now that wood fence is actually built onto their property. So when you rebuild that wall, it's going to open up more landscape opportunities for the residential neighbors as well. So I would, again, I'd be supportive of the modification for the parking encroachment into the interior setbacks. I would support the conditional use permit for the parking in the R1 lot. But that's and I would support a slight reduction in parking. It's probably going to be maybe 1 or 2 stalls, but I couldn't support eliminating 4 or 5 stalls to eliminate the full necessity for the CUP. So I'd be interested to hear my colleagues so we can discuss this.
Commissioner Bartlett?
Yes.
One thing I did want to point out, you had mentioned the possible reduction of parking. That would require a parking modification,
right,
which was not noticed and therefore could not be addressed at this hearing.
Right.
The applicant's proposal, Alternative B, which staff hadn't seen previously, although we do think that it's a good solution, that accommodates the 25 parking stalls and so therefore wouldn't need a parking modification.
Right. So if they kept the 25 stalls, then we could do it and take an action at this meeting. But if it ends up going under, then we'll have to continue. Okay, great. Okay, who had their light on first? Honor system. Okay, Commissioner Schwartz. All of a sudden, they're all on. So, all right, we'll just start from the right. And
Mr. Chair, speaking of parking, I'm wondering if a parking modification is actually really needed, because as I look at the site plan and from being at the site on Tuesday, it did not appear to me that every stall or every parking space is equal. In other words, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to slim down some of the parking spaces to actually, kind of reconfigure or restripe this to accommodate for 25 as is. And so I'll just leave that with you to, do you have a thought about that?
The existing parking spaces are actually substandard as they are. They're not quite wide enough, and the parking stall is also not quite wide enough. It's close, but transportation is willing to allow it to continue, obviously as an existing non-conforming. But our new parking would need to comply with current requirements, is my understanding. So the three spaces in the R1 that we're proposing in the R1 zone meet current requirements. Those spaces that are existing in the C2 zone are slightly substandard, close to current standard, but slightly smaller. Mm-hmm. If I could, one more second, the alternate B would not require a parking modification. We actually can fit all 6 spaces in the R1 zone there.
Okay.
Okay,
good.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Jostis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you point out an interesting dilemma about the CUP and the parking piece, and I have to admit I'm still uncomfortable with granting a CUP for non-residential parking in a residential zone, and I want to ask staff for some clarification, maybe some help here. The other options, I mean, at least one option is to rezone that R1 portion to C2, which is what the general plan intends anyway. We've gone through the environmental review for the general plan update, so we have I know when you go from a CUP to a rezone, you leave the safety of a categorical exemption. And so I'm trying not to send the applicant down a cul-de-sac of more red tape and more unnecessary analysis. I'm wondering what other options we have to try to accommodate the parking which is, I think, the intent of the commission here. Most people are okay with that, without getting into the orange areas of a conditional use permit, which some of us have concerns over.
Mr. Chair, I'm hearing Commissioner Joseph's comment, and I'm understanding where he's going. And my only comment to that would be, if you're comfortable with considering a rezone, which would allow for any allowed use of the C2 zone on this property, at every corner of this property, why not be comfortable with granting a conditional use permit for a very limited scope, which is non-residential parking of 3 parking spaces, where you're guaranteed that that is the scope of your action. You're not worried about a new office building going in that corner or something else. You have a plan. You're going to, if you grant the conditional use permit for the 3 parking spaces, that is the scope of the permit. And if the property is later rezoned C2 as the general plan update anticipates, that CUP is no longer necessary. It becomes an allowed use. But if you're prepared to go down the path of considering a rezone, I think it's a much smaller, measured step to consider the conditional use permit for that parking space today.
That's helpful, Mr. Vincent. I could move that direction, and I think to do so, if we could make some reference about the uniqueness of this, as you have said, the uniqueness of this particular property in the context of everything else. If we can incorporate that uniqueness into the findings, then maybe we can get there.
Chair Bartlett?
Yes.
If I could just add on to that, CUP for parking and parking area is something that has been approved on the 1700 block of State Street. We've had 2 projects within the last 5 years where that was approved. Also, the gas station on the right-hand side and then the office use on the left-hand side of this project site both have CUPs for parking. So it is something that's done in this area on several parcels. Also, the CUP that allows it is very specific. It says driveways and parking areas for non-residential uses in residential zones. And so we think that between that and also the language in the conditions of approval, which says it's specifically for this, it does not include trash or the patio and deck area, we think that that's sufficient to ensure that it's only the parking that gets used. The other thing I'd like to add is if you are comfortable with something more like alternate 2 or B, then we want to give them the flexibility of more than just the 3 spaces that were originally shown. With alternate B, it has 6 spaces in the R1 zone. So just something to be cognizant of when you're making a motion.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Joseph, you had a response?
Yeah, I'm completely okay with that approach, and I think Ms. DeBusk's ideas about expanding the wording of the motion to accommodate those additional parking spaces is clearly the way to go, because option B seems to be the one that everybody's landing on as a better approach. So,
great, Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. I wonder if we could take a look at the alternate B and consider that as something that we may or may not be making a motion to support. And again, it's only on the large plans, it's not on the staff report. But in looking at the required applications that we would, and findings that we would need to make, we would need to make the modification to allow parking to encroach into the interior setback, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, then we would need to make, we would not need to make modification 2 to allow the trash enclosure to encroach because it would be in the C2. So modification 2 goes away. And then we get to the tricky part, the conditional use permit. We would be making a recommendation or approving a conditional use permit to allow a driveway and non-residential parking in a residential zone. And that actually exists on the city's list of options for CUPs in R1. It's number I, just for the people that didn't read the whole list, it's already on there. We would not be allowing a CUP for a non-residential trash enclosure because it would be moved into the C2. And regarding the deck and patio area, I think we need to talk a little bit more about this one. Per the staff report, even if we wanted to approve the as-built deck, we couldn't do it because there's no place to go in city policy to make that finding. So basically, the as-built patio and so on is a goner. You're going to be starting from scratch with that one. So looking at that as bare land, what would the commission see going back there? Is it just landscaping? Is it at-grade landscaping? I think the more specific we can be, the better. And if that were to be put into a motion, would we have it covered?
Chair Bartlett, we believe so. Yes.
Ms. DeBus, could you clarify again, if we take out on the CUP, if you take out the word deck and we only keep patio, which is on grade, is that allowable then?
Chair Bartlett, a patio would be allowed without any permits from the Planning Commission. So you could certainly put that in, and you could put additional limitations if you think the grading should be a certain way or terraced, or if you have particular feelings that you want to convey to the Design Review Board.
Right, but it's the deck that becomes a structure that's subject to setbacks. Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I think one other thing, because there's this grade factor here, and I don't know the site well enough, but maybe there's some terracing walls or something like that that are already there. A terracing wall is indistinguishable from residential, non-residential. So I think if we're going to minimize the amount of earth movement and grading, fill, export, whatever we're going here, one way to approach this would be, if it's simply a retaining wall, the Commission could consider having that retaining wall stay as an allowed use of R1. The raised deck structure that requires a building permit is not available for a CUP. A at-grade patio doesn't require a building permit, is therefore similar to R1 uses or landscaping uses, and therefore you do not have to, a CUP would not be required by the applicant to make such a structure on the property. Or, I'm sorry, not to use the word structure, facility. Structure is defined differently.
Okay, so those answer my questions about what would be needed for a motion.
Okay.
How we would specify the planting area.
Okay. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what's on the screen pretty much covers what we've been talking about. And a question, if it was rezoned to C2, they would then be able to put the trash enclosure wherever they like, wouldn't they? So I don't think we want to go that way. Well, and I think that's, Mr. Joseph, I think you're okay with the CUP for the parking only. Okay, well, I would move to concur with the staff recommendation and make the findings and the conditions that are in the staff report.
Second.
Under discussion.
Okay, Ms. Larson?
Just very quickly, I would like to add that I'm looking forward to the use of high-quality materials. And so as this passes along to HLC, I would like to have that go with our recommendations, that we use high-quality materials, good construction methods, et cetera. Thanks.
Ms. Lodge, are you making any reference at all to the alternate B that was in here?
Well, I'm willing to leave it up to the applicant to decide where.
Okay, this wording allows them to go there.
Yeah, to put the trash enclosure wherever they want, but it's to be covered and to be, well done so that it's an addition. And of course, on the Plan B, as I read it, the trash structures are 10 feet away from the wall, where they don't, from the property line. And they can be right, because it's C2, they can be right up at the property line. So you have a lot more room to play with.
Yeah. Mr. Cotto?
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bartlett. I just want to make sure that the motion, if you follow the staff recommendation, would not allow alternative A, which has the trash enclosure in the R1 zone. Only it allows something like B, which is, no one ever asked us, but we're comfortable with that too.
Okay. All right, I make that part of the motion, that we approve Plan B with flexibility in placement of the trash enclosure.
Okay, Mr. Justice.
My only addition is to just offer the comment that if that patio non-deck area has some degree of landscaping in it, it would certainly make it a much more attractive spot for people to congregate, as opposed to all the rest of the concrete and asphalt that we've got here. And, hopefully that would generate, a really nice feeling and bring people back, give us some not tax increment, but some transient occupancy tax to help keep things moving.
I guess I was assuming that was a given, that it would be developed as a garden and Mr. Murphy referred to different seating areas back there to accommodate, provide amenities for the guests.
Yes, Mr. Peony.
Yeah, if you have time, if you could visit my hotel, the Villa Rosa at 15 Chapala Street, and you can see what I did in the gardens there. I want to do the same thing to here as I did at the Villa Rosa. So feel free to visit that, and you'll get an idea of how it flows.
Have you changed it since it was originally built?
But all the gardens have been changed.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'd like you to do.
That was one of our original projects, so I was just trying to
Please
understand.
visit them, yeah.
Okay.
And then you can see that the people really enjoy their space and the gardens and the feeling I've got birds coming in, and it's really nice.
Okay. And I do see that Mr. Watson would like to make a comment before we vote on our motion.
Just a quick comment about the garden space. I have a feeling, knowing the handicapped laws in Chapter 11 of the Building Code, that will, my guess is that will probably drive the height of that grade. And I might just bring that up to you so that you can consider that. Otherwise, it's going to be a maze of ramps. So I just thought I might bring that up so that everybody can start considering it right now.
Thank you. And while we're under discussion, two comments from my perspective that I don't think undo the motion. One is that I think that the grade of the earth in this back patio garden area should not be elevated higher than the adjacent grades on the adjoining properties. I think they're pretty close to matching right now, so I think that would keep those down. And then also, if we are giving them guidance that we prefer the direction of alternate B without tying their hands to it literally, obviously we know the setbacks and everything aren't a requirement. I would suggest that if that trash enclosure does rotate 90 degrees and take up less space, shift all of that parking on the southerly property line back and provide the landscape at State Street, or some of it. But I'll let you design it, but I just wanted to plant that seed. So with that, unless there's any further discussion, I'll call for the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations, you have a project. It's appealable within 10 days. Hopefully it won't. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the good plan. What'd you do?
Yeah.
Stamp the one that has alternative B on it.
Okay, we're now down to our administrative agenda, so we'll have committee and liaison reports if anybody has anything to report on. Ms. Larson, did you have any update on the staff hearing officer?
I haven't watched the rerun yet
Okay.
on my computer, so I don't yet. But I do, when you come to announcements, have something.
Okay. Any other reports? None? Okay.
My little announcement.
Right, okay. Announcements?
My little announcement is to everybody watching, I happened to run into someone from the Unity Shop, and they do need volunteers. And this year, more than ever, if maybe we don't have so much money, but maybe we have a little extra time. So if you find yourself with a little extra time, look around yourselves this holiday season and do what I'm going to do. Find a spot that needs help and go chip in. Thanks.
Okay, and our last announcement is a reminder to everybody that this is First Thursday, so let's get out and enjoy and support the local business community and art community. So with that, the meeting is adjourned.